Well, today we had some plenary. Because we have people online. Already, we're live.
Very exciting. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Roundtable Experts to discuss geoengineering ethics in COP29. I'm Samson Rainey from AGU's Media Relations Office, and I'm excited to have everyone here to talk about a topic that's increasingly finding its way into public discourse: climate intervention research and ethics. We'll end at 5:15 or when there are no more questions. We'll begin with the panelists giving brief presentations before opening up to questions and discussion. Please state name and affiliation when asking your question. Also a reminder that the roundtables are more informal, so please don't hesitate to chime in, build off the conversation, and so forth. A reminder that this is being recorded and the recording will be posted to AGU's YouTube channel and linked to the press information exchange roughly within an hour or so of the internet. For those online, if you have any issues, please email news@agu.org. All right, let's quickly introduce our panel. In the middle here, we have our AGU president, Lisa Bromwich. Thank you for being here, Lisa. To Lisa's right, we have Janice LaChance, interim CEO and executive director. Hi, Janice.
Hi.
And to Lisa's left, we have Margaret Leinen, director of Scripps Institution of Oceanography and vice chancellor for marine science, UC San Diego. Thank you, Margaret, for being here. Let's get going. Let's turn it over to Lisa to start us off.
Thank you, Samson, and thank you all for being here. It's a busy time. It's the end of the busy second day at COP. As Samson mentioned, oh my gosh, I just was right back there. It's that red. Oh, okay. Here we are, the end of a busy day. So I serve as president of AGU and am so happy you're here. Earlier today, this afternoon, there was a very thought-provoking panel on the ethical framework that touched on a range of science, ethics, and climate justice issues. If you weren't able to attend, I highly suggest that you watch that recording. It's going to be available on the AGU YouTube page by this evening. I think everyone in this room is probably aware of AGU's long history as a meeting convener and a publisher of what are now 24 peer-reviewed geoscience journals that cover discovery as well as solution science. I just want to say that I thank you for your reporting on the kind of work that we publish in our journals and speak about at this meeting. What you are doing is a crucial act of public service. Thank you all. In addition to providing career support and training for members and advocating for equity in our field, AGU has long been involved in scientific ethics. And because of the high stakes involved with climate intervention research, we believed it was our responsibility to get involved in the conversation. We also believe that we have a responsibility at the UN Climate Change Conference to amplify scientific voices, advocate for evidence-based climate solutions, and foster global partnerships that transform scientific knowledge into actionable policies. So let me explain a little bit about how our engagement in climate intervention research ethics aligns with our participation in the UN Climate Change Conference. Okay, so pause and recall back that under the 2015 Paris Agreement, nations are committed to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees C, above pre-industrial levels, with efforts to keep it under 1.5 degrees C through nationally determined contributions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Despite ambitious pledges, greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise, many nations have struggled to implement the deep systemic changes that are required for this goal. And because of this, the IPCC has stated that limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C and potentially even 2 degrees C will require some level of carbon removal in addition to reducing emissions. Let me just say and emphasize that as far as AGU is concerned, first and foremost, aggressive actions must remain the primary strategy for reversing and addressing climate change. That said, given the situation we are in, and the world is increasingly considering climate intervention approaches, also called geoengineering, either to remove carbon dioxide or to lessen the harmful effects of climate change. Today, a variety of climate intervention technologies are in either the research or the deployment stage, including both land and ocean-based carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation modification. These technologies are at different stages of maturity. Some of them are untested and their consequences are not well understood. So there are major practical and ethical questions about the significant risks and potential trade-offs some of these approaches would bring and how they would be measured against the risks of our warming world. The enormity of what's at stake requires a measured, transparent, inclusive, and altogether ethical foundation for evaluating the impacts of climate intervention technologies. This realization led us to a 2-year collaborative effort with a global panel of experts in climate science, technology, ethics, and policy, resulting in what we're talking about today, which is the ethical framework principles for climate intervention research. Published in October, the framework serves as a valuable resource to support governments, researchers, NGOs, and the private sector in making responsible decisions regarding climate intervention research and policy. It outlines guiding principles and key steps to considering, offering a structured approach for thoughtful ethical engagement. The 5 principles are responsible research, climate justice, inclusive public participation, transparency, and informed governance. And you can see detailed descriptions in the slide at the head of the room. So this framework draws heavily from ethical precedents developed for biomedical research and genetic engineering, fields where the stakes for humanity and the environment are equally profound. It also builds on early guiding principles specific to climate intervention, such as the Oxford Principles, the Asilomar recommendations, and the Tollgate Principles. This framework is not only grounded in science, but also heavily informed by the global community. The advisory board that we work with comprises a panel of experts on climate science, policy, and technological innovation from every region around the globe. We are very fortunate to have Margaret Leinen, one of the Framework Advisory Board members and a
I have
past
some editing you could do. You want to help?
with us today. This draft framework went through a 3-month public comment period and consultation process to include more holistic input from other scientists and ethicists, as well as community voices, youth advocates, and many more. So this is a framework informed by and built by our global society, which brings us to our engagement at COP29. I'm going to respectfully ask that everybody mute while they're on this COP. I think we're hearing a few conversations. We're hearing global voices weighing in here. From our home base at the Ocean Pavilion AGU either hosted or participated in no fewer than 11 events at COP29, which included a lot of rich discussion about climate intervention, research ethics. To add to that, AGU held more than 18 bilateral meetings with governments and NGOs, fostering deeper partnerships through shared goals and roadmaps to accomplish them. All right, now I've set the stage. I'd like to pass it to Janice. I would like to pause for a minute. Is there anything we can do about the background noise?
I think that I have found them.
Thank
Wow.
you, thank you.
Well,
Yes, we, you know, it kind of is, we have this theme about sort of multiple voices, and I sort of thought it was multiple voices informing the policies, but it was multiple voices in real time. So Janice, will you offer your perspective on
Sure.
the framework?
I've always heard the owls are really good, so I didn't know they would actually fill in for us, so that's great. I also want to introduce Brandon Jones, who's here with us. Brandon is AGU's president-elect for about 2 weeks, 2 more weeks, and then he becomes president on January 1 for 2 magnificent years. So we're excited about that, but thank you so much, Lisa. Lisa's been a great partner on some of these global events and really thinking through how AGU can best have an impact on a global stage, which is frankly relatively new for us. So it's really exciting to have heard from her. And I want to add my thanks to the press corps who's here. We're excited about the numbers. We think this is an important way to give voice to the great discoveries and ideas that have been shared and debated this entire week. So I know there's hundreds of talks. I hope you all can find a few to write about because I think it's very important. So I think everyone in this room at least agrees that science has broad repercussions and can have great impact. Climate intervention research in particular actually goes far beyond the laboratory at this point, and it carries profound consequences for our collective future. Because of its global reach and scope, the UNFCCC and COP really are crucial platforms for engaging a broad section of stakeholders on the issue and many others. COP enables us to bring together diverse voices to discuss what equitable and ethical decision-making should look like for our climate challenges and any potential solutions. And that's important because many climate intervention technologies, as you all know from your reporting, don't and can't and aren't designed to respect national boundaries. So what might be a great victory in one region or area may cause some big problems in others. And we believe at AGU that the framework is a pathway to global participation and international cooperation. And as Lisa pointed out, for the 2 weeks we were at COP29, we participated in events and bilats with governments, NGOs, and intergovernmental bodies on this topic and really trying to advance the ethical framework. We met with people from all over the world, from tiny little islands in the Pacific Ocean, all the way to some very powerful organizations and nations involved in this. There was a diversity of points of view and interests. And really the framework served as a cornerstone for these conversations about the emerging technologies. And as AGU delegates, we were pretty clear that ethics has to take center stage in crafting solutions that are to be both equitable and inclusive. And as Lisa mentioned, we firmly believe there's no replacement for mitigation, and AGU continues to be a strong advocate and a voice for emission reductions. That has to be the first line of defense, then we can talk about climate intervention and ethics. Through thoughtful dialogue and active listening, we recognized a strong desire from everyone we met with to continue the conversation and deepen engagement on these issues and on an ethical framework. And we're committed to advancing this work at the local, national, and international levels in the coming year and beyond. So this is not a report that's written, published, and done. We're not putting it on the shelf. There's going to be an ongoing effort to inform people about it and to get it adopted. And I know the topic continues to draw a lot of global attention. I'm sure you all know about the European Commission's scientific advice mechanism, who issued a report yesterday that cautioned that solar radiation modification technologies are not sufficiently mature to allow for their safe deployment. And the recommendation was that research must be conducted ethically. Now, I'd like to take a moment, if I could, to highlight some of the key stakeholders communities that we are engaging with, whose involvement is essential to the goals of the framework and getting it accepted. And I would also argue that the framework serves as a vital and impactful tool for advancing their causes and interests, not just ours, not just the communities that are impacted. So I want to start with the funders. There's a lot of money going into this work, going into this research. And how can we acknowledge the critical role of funding in all of this? But we also believe that it has to be fully transparent. And the projects the funders choose to support should be clear about what the goals are and where the funds are coming from. Adhering to transparency ensures that all funding sources are disclosed and that researchers, and this is actually crucial for our members, maintain autonomy in their decisions free from undue influence. It's a critical part of the framework. And by following these principles, funders safeguard the integrity of the research while instilling public trust at the same time. Another audience is policymakers. The framework provides a roadmap for guiding legislation and governance, ensuring that research aligns with societal values, legal standards, and ethical principles. Again, transparency, as most would agree, is also essential to sound governance, and this framework reinforces the importance of that at every step. And the principle of informed governance couldn't be more tailored to policy making. Informed governance means that policymakers should establish robust accountability mechanisms, such as independent review boards and publicly represented panels to oversee research and its potential societal and environmental impacts. This structured oversight would not only reduce risks, but also build trust from the public that the decisions being made are serving the broader societal interest. Now, the last stakeholder community I'll mention is civil society, which includes advocacy organizations, NGOs, and associations like AGU, which play a crucial role in amplifying the framework's call for inclusive public participation, another key principle in the framework. We stress the need to engage impacted communities, especially those most vulnerable and historically marginalized. We want to ensure that their voices shape research agendas and decision-making in ways that are ethical and justice-driven. The large presence of civil society organizations, communities, and indigenous peoples at COP is really an incredibly powerful collection of voices for responsible and just climate action. And we were pleased to talk with them and work with them the entire time we were there. And there's one more stakeholder community whose work is vital to understanding some of the benefits and risks of climate intervention technologies, as well as to advancing responsible science. And I'm referring to AGU members, the researcher community, and to speak about opportunities and challenges in that space. I'm going to turn it over to Margaret Leinen, who is not only a member of the advisory board for the ethical framework, but a past AGU president and a much beloved one. So Margaret brings a wealth of information and experience in promoting scientific ethics, and we're really fortunate to have her with us today. Margaret.
Thank you, Janice. Janice and Lisa asked me to talk a little bit about what happened in this space of ethics for climate intervention, geoengineering in the past, and how we got to the point that AGU decided to take this on. I spent the decade of the 90s as part of the International Geosphere Biosphere Program. And that was a large international, loosely organized group that did a lot of research in biogeochemistry. It also did work in solar interactions, and much of the research that was done by that group played the foundation of understanding some of the processes that are now being proposed for climate intervention. And one of my co-leads for that was Paul Crutzen, who was Nobel laureate for his work on chlorofluorocarbons. In 2003, Paul published a very provocative article saying that he had been watching the progress on emissions, that he was demoralized by the lack of progress on emissions, and that he felt that we were going to look at a time when something would have to be done because the impacts of climate change would be so severe that people would be calling out for adaptation and for something in addition to mitigation. And around that time, many think spurred by the fact that Paul published that, we saw a number of organizations start planning activities precisely for the purpose of offsetting carbon in the case of CDR or intervening in the case of SRM. And most of those were funded by the private sector with the intention that they would pay for the experiments with carbon credits or some kind of equivalent. And that resulted in a lot of behavior that was, in the best of cases, was done with strong ethics, and the worst of cases was totally motivated by profit. And that led several groups to start talking about the ethics. And I should say at the time, the major national research foundations like NSF or NERC in the UK were not funding research like this. They had done a little bit of work with modeling, but they weren't funding experiments out in open nature because of the lack of controls and so forth. And so I talked to Paul about this, and he agreed to join with me to hold a conference that would be focused on trying to set up a series of principles for climate intervention research, whether it was SRM or CDR. Before we got to that conference, a group of scientists from UK developed, it wasn't published until 2013, but a document that was circulating prominently in the community that they called the Oxford Principles. And they were principles for not just for research, but for deployment. And the House of Commons in UK was also looking into this. And they actually published the Oxford Principles before the authors published the Oxford Principles. But it was the first time when this was being discussed. And the Oxford Principles were certainly informed by, fantastic scientists who worked in policy and so forth, but it was their document. And that started to generate a lot of discussion that it was, what was so special about this group of people that they could set the rules for the principles and so forth. And that was motivating the Asilomar Conference on climate intervention. And so that was a conference of about 100 people that included historians, ethicists, environmental lawyers, nonprofits, government, Native American groups, and so forth. And it was purposely held at Asilomar because the Asilomar Conference on Recombinant DNA had been led by Paul Berg. And he joined us in sponsoring the Asilomar Conference. And they were purposeful references because they had been successful with that self-regulation for recombinant DNA. And so those recommendations came from the group in 2010. I think that, in spite of how hard we worked, I would say that the impact of that was minimal. And once again, it was that, well, okay, now a slightly larger group of people came out with these principles, but there wasn't any formal way to discuss them. And then since then, it's not only the Tollgate group, we've had 5 or 6 different groups who have looked at it again and published principles, and most of them are very similar. The Oxford Principles look very much like this. They said that instead of responsible research, they were focused on that this should only be undertaken for the global benefit as opposed to for commercial activity. But inclusive public participation, transparency, informed governance were all there. I think what's happened since then is the drumbeat of climate justice, of ethics associated with not just climate intervention, but all climate action has really taken center stage, and really, and that has been an evolution. But when AGU talked to me about wanting to do this, I was really strongly encouraging, because AGU has a global footprint. It has scientists in every field. It certainly has people who are violently opposed to any kind of climate intervention, as well as people who are convinced that we will have to do it and that we must do research, and everybody in between. And AGU has enormous convening power. The AGU meeting is a great example. And I felt that if there was any group that could pull together expertise from all over and from all fields to develop a set of ideas for an ethical framework, that it was AGU. And we also talked extensively at the time about their goal to not only develop these, but then also to engage the public with discussion of them. And that it wasn't even enough for AGU members and the people that were on there to draft this. It really had to be responsive. I think that for me, the great opportunity, I think, for this is that it could give non-private sector or business investment the, if you want to call it license or cover or assurance that they could fund research and not immediately be accused of having a for-profit motive or whatever. So, we don't have research, field research for this purpose funded by NSF or NASA or NOAA. Likewise, in most countries, a couple of NERC experiments were halted because of a public outcry. And I think that that this set of principles may start the discussion, which would allow some research to go forward. And I speak for myself as an AGU member, but the leadership of AGU any longer. I'm very proud of AGU for taking it on. There was dissent about this, and I think that they did it in a way that sort of kept opening it to additional communities for discussion, and as they've said, have been committed to keeping it open for more discussion. So I'll stop there, but that's a little bit of the sort of the background and history of what has gone on before.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Kyle. We can now open it up to questions, starting in the room.
The question is for you, Margaret.
Well, could you state name and affiliation?
Yes, my name is Alex Solomon. I'm at Nature Magazine. So you noted that the Asilomar conference, the impact of that was minimal. I'm wondering what makes this different, and what do you hope to see?
I think there's several things. One is that the level of consultation outside of the drafting group was extraordinarily different. And AGU was very clear about what they were doing. And so they engaged many more people. And the other thing is that they were able to engage agencies and the COP and the UNFCCC in a way that the Asilomar group could. I think the other critical thing that happened between 2010 and 2023 was the IPCC report on 1.5, which said we won't get there without removal of carbon. And that was a potent message, and it was a real wake-up call for a lot of people. That doesn't mean that the community is saying, oh, we all agree and we ought to engage in climate intervention. But I think it made people realize that they would have to grapple with the issue.
Yes.
Yeah, Zach Coleman, Politico. Sorry. I mean, you mentioned that NSF isn't funding climate intervention research. I mean, has there been an attempt?
No, experiments in
Experiments, sorry.
nature.
Has there
They
been-
funded modeling
Right.
and so forth.
Has there been an attempt to engage NSF about this framework? Has there been any interest in incorporating that to do the type of field experiments that you're talking about?
I think that's a question.
Yeah. Do you want to go ahead?
You go ahead.
Yeah, we have been briefing NSF and a number of other funding agencies across the government, the entire process, and the national academies. So we have been telling them about our progress, first our intention, then our progress. Obviously, they couldn't participate, they couldn't necessarily be hands-on and involved, but we have been well received across the board. NOAA, NASA, NSF. We'll have to wait and see whether they decide to include it. in their funding offerings, and whether that's something that we could get to at some point.
So years ago, I met you because you were involved with a company called Climus.
Climos.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, could you state your name and?
Oh, sorry, Lynn Sherry, freelance journalist. And I was wondering what the status of Climus is now and how that ties in with these, working on these regulations.
So Climos was trying to spur a large in the water experiment. And they were sort of looking at things like the Oxford Principles as a key that would allow them to do a big experiment. And I think that after about 2012, it was clear that that wasn't going to happen. And so it was a private enterprise. It wasn't funded. It wasn't a 501c3. So they stopped operation.
So it's not happening.
Well, not from them.
Uh-huh.
There are groups, I'm aware of. Well, just for ocean iron fertilization, I'm aware of 3 groups that are academic scientists that are engaged in planning, and they're taking it very slowly and very carefully on ocean alkalinization. There are a couple of large research groups, and then there are a number of small companies in the ocean alkalinity space. And there's a bunch of other stuff. I mean, things, both ocean iron fertilization and ocean alkalinity require, a fairly extensive at-sea activity, and they can't really be done out of somebody's back pocket. There are other things that are much smaller activities that have been undertaken by small companies. For example, artificial upwelling, the idea of growing kelp and sinking kelp, etc. And then there's solar radiation management, which really has there are a couple of companies that have been in that space for a long time. They haven't been able to do any large scale experiments.
Yes.
Alex, nature. So, framework is all good and fine, but what's gonna happen if private interests aren't signing up for it? So I'm wondering if AGU has talked to, for instance, Make Sunsets or any of the other groups acting unilaterally on this. And you also mentioned that you've engaged with private funders. I'm wondering, are they willing to adopt this, and who?
Wait and see. Yeah, we're hoping. I call this a campaign, although, since the fall, that's probably had a bad connotation. But, this is not the end of this process, and we're just going to keep charging away. I mean, we think this is important. It's a centerpiece. It builds on AGU's strong leadership in ethics, overall scientific ethics. In addition to what Margaret said, our convening power. And it is, we believe, the right moment for this. There's a lot of interest. That still doesn't mean that there's a lot of willingness to add layers, add additional burdens. We heard some of this at COP from people who are actually engaging in the research. That doesn't mean it's not worthwhile. I think it's just a matter of educating researchers and educating those constituencies that I described in my talk. So hopefully, we're not going to give up. I hope they continue listening.
Are you able to elaborate a little bit on the people doing the research saying they don't want to add additional layers, like
Mhm.
something more
Well,
tangible?
I think there's a sense from some researchers that they're already ethical, right? Scientists are ethical and we believe that as well. So it isn't a situation where we're saying you're not ethical, so you need some fundamental ethics. There's already a foundation of ethics that they operate with. We just believe that, and the advisory board believes that this should go further because it has such an impact on communities. It has an impact on the public. And potentially, as I mentioned, global, I mean, somebody today on the panel, this afternoon, if you heard it, but somebody said this could lead to war, right? If there are some global implications of this down the road. So, to us, this is just a fundamental piece, but it's still an added step. I'm not using the word burden, so don't anybody write that. But, some people would perceive it as just more work, more bureaucracy. Why do I have to have a public meeting? I'm a scientist. I don't often talk to the public. They're not all like Margaret, Lisa, and Brandon, this public facing part perhaps doesn't come naturally to a lot of people. And so how do we get them ready for that? How do we help scientists get better and really sharpen that talent that they have and make sure that they can get that buy-in up front?
Well, you talked about climate justice as being one of the main principles here. I mean, you were at the COP, that's pretty much a whole conference about climate justice. Were there any governments that you met with that said part of our climate justice would be using solar radiation management or any sort of other climate intervention to make our lives more sustainable? Was there any communication on that from governments?
We don't, not from governments. There are some organizations that firmly believe that, and that's fine. There's room for everybody. We just think this is the best way to go. But we haven't heard that from governments.
Okay, you'll have to excuse me, but a lot of this sounds to me, a lot like, Kumbaya, or let's all, who was it? Rodney King, let's all just get together. When will AGU call for accountability and enforcement? And when will there be a step up beyond, shouldn't we just all agree to, hey, let's call for action here? Because what I'm hearing is, let's all just be nice to each other.
You're the nicest person I know. Do you want to take that?
So,
Oh, I'm
Jake's with the
Rick
register.
McCluskey with the register.
Yeah.
I actually really appreciate that question, because what it does is clarify the role of AGU in convening a community that is both AGU members, but goes far beyond AGU members to come up with the principles. But AGU is not the enforcement mechanism. We are not the governing body that would then, be the gatekeepers as to whether this is useful or not useful.
But might you suggest enforcement?
I think that the existence of the principles suggests enforcement. So if I can offer my own lived experience as dean of a very large college of the environment at the University of Washington, a university that has solar radiation management research as part of a research portfolio. As the dean of a reputable public university, I needed to make decisions and guidance to my faculty and researchers about what would be a proper way to proceed with research. This was happening 2012. I had no guidance other than, kind of calling my colleagues and saying, what do you think we should do here? This allows, and I'm now Dean Emeritus, I'm not in this position, had this been in place for myself and my vice president for research, I would have had much greater and much more intelligent ways of discerning, the difference between a bench experiment versus a small scale. I mean, we keep using the word scale. Is a small scale, a bathtub, or is it, a small, sort of inlet? I mean, and all of this stuff needs to be sorted out. I think of this a lot like the way in which human subjects research within US academic situations is regulated. And, I'm sure when that first started, there were people like, oh, this is burdensome, et cetera, et cetera. But that is a key way in which ethics are regulated by government, funding agencies and, in the case of academic researchers, other biomedical places. And it's just regular business as usual at this point. My vision, this has not been vetted by my colleagues, but my vision is there will be a business as usual culture within 5 to 10 years. And this is the first step. I hope that's useful about how, kind of a use case scenario where, oh my goodness, I wish I had had this.
If I could do a quick follow-up.
Yeah, we have time for one last question.
Okay, this is really fast. I'll talk quickly. Due to the fact that internationally, there's been a populist right-wing movement, your attitude towards just being suggestive is going to become less important because the financial situations pushed by the right wing are going to ignore it. How do you respond to that?
Do you want to take this one? Sure. So, that may be true. I can't read and I don't have a crystal ball, right? So I don't know what's going to happen with this. But I do know I read the headlines. I try to read more than that, but over the last several months, companies have been shut down. Experiments have been shut down all over the world, not just in San Francisco, not just in some very specific situations. So there'll be counter forces pushing back against this. But at the end of the day, if you're not going to be able to sustain your business operation, your profit expectations without having an ethical framework at your back and helping you, then to me, that neutralizes any scenario that you've described.
Thank you.
And with that, I'd like to thank our panel for the thoughtful responses and the reporters for the great probing questions. This concludes our roundtable. Thanks so much.